Tonight on Ukraine Today, new strikes on Russian military airfields. What equipment was destroyed by Ukraine's defense forces? A night of terror across Ukraine. Russians launched hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles on peaceful cities and towns. Civilians are dead. Worrying news from the Sumy region. Russian troops managed to capture more villages. Putin's new excuses, why the Russian dictator refuses direct talks with Ukraine's President Zelensky. And friends no more? Tensions rise between Trump and Musk. What does it mean for the US and for Ukraine? All this and more in today's episode of Ukraine Today. Hello there, we're from Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Lobchun. Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's begin. Russia launched a massive overnight attack with drones and missiles on peaceful Ukrainian cities and towns. Kyiv was hit with direct strikes and falling debris across multiple districts. At least 3 people were killed, all emergency responders. Dozens more were injured. Apartment blocks and subway tracks were damaged. In the Kyiv region, train lines were also hit. Ternopil was attacked with Caliber missiles and drones. 6 people were wounded. In Chernihiv, there were ballistic strikes and drone attacks. Civilian homes and critical infrastructure were damaged. In Lutsk, a missile hit a residential building. At least 1 dead, dozens injured. In the Lviv region, drones and missiles damaged an industrial site and power lines. In Poltava region, administrative buildings, warehouses, and even a local coffee shop were hit. 3 people were injured. And just to give you a sense of the scale, here are the numbers. The Russians launched 407 drones and 45 missiles, ballistic, cruise missiles, combat drones and decoys, all launched from multiple directions at once. The goal was to overwhelm Ukraine's air defenses, but nearly 90% of those targets were successfully intercepted. Ukraine is fighting for freedom. Support independent Ukrainian journalism so we can keep telling the truth about Russia's war. Click the link in the description to become our sponsor. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe. It really helps. Meanwhile, massive hits on Russian military airfields and bases in Russia and the temporary occupied territories. Engels Air Base was targeted. That's where Russian aircrafts are stationed. In Saratov region, multiple military fuel storage facilities were hit, sparking a huge fire. In the Ryazan region, Diaghilevo Air Base was also struck, home to refueling aircrafts and fighter jets. That's also where Russian strategic bombers take off from. Ukraine also hit a logistic hub in the Kursk region, and we already know that a Russian Mi-8 helicopter was destroyed at the Bryansk military airbase. On top of that, there was a fire at the Progress plant in the Tambov region. The plant is considered one of Russia's leading missile and aviation manufacturers. Let's move to the Sumy region. The occupiers are advancing. They've taken over several more villages at a huge cost in lives just in the past 24 hours. Altogether, Russia lost at least 1,160 soldiers killed and wounded. But the advance continues. That's deeply troubling. Here's more from the Sumy front and the other battle zones.
The enemy continues to press along the entire front line.
There has been a sharp escalation of combat clashes along the entire length of the front. That's about 1,200 kilometers. Moreover, it should be noted that over the past 2 weeks, the intensity of combat clashes has increased by a third.
The situation in northeastern Ukraine is rapidly deteriorating. After the Russian invaders made a series of breakthroughs in early June, at least 5 villages came under enemy control, according to the General Staff. Among them are Velika Pisarivka, Rizivka, and several other small border settlements.
It is worth recalling that as early as last year, the enemy began amassing forces, both personnel and equipment, which were primarily used against Ukraine's defense forces conducting and still conducting their operation within the Kursk region. And it is precisely from these forces that the enemy is deploying infantry groups in an attempt to enter our territory. But if we compare the length of the border with Russia within the Sumy region, it is more than 550 kilometers, and the areas where the enemy is using small-scale assault tactics are actually quite limited.
According to the latest data from Deep State, the enemy is present in the villages of Andrivka and Ikvodolahi.
The Russians are conducting tactical operations to establish a new northern front line, just as we are doing on both sides. In other words, the Russians are trying to cut off our territorial salient into Russian territory. We, in turn, are trying, literally just a dozen kilometers to the west, to cut off a similar salient into our territory, also near Terkino. So, in other words, both sides are simultaneously establishing a line of contact. The problem is that this line runs not far from our capital, but the same trouble exists in Kyiv and Kherson. That is with our regional centers, and Zaporizhia is also not far off. So we have issues with our regional centers. They are either close to the Russian border or to the line of contact, the front line. Basically, you could say from Sumy to Kherson.
The main goal of Putin's people is to create a buffer zone.
The main objectives of the occupiers are to gain direct control over the settlements of Yunakivka and Putin'S specifically. Control over these settlements will allow the Russian occupation forces to keep the residential districts of the regional center under fire control, including with the use of both tube and rocket artillery.
Yes, the enemy is rapidly approaching the regional center. The Russians are only 22 kilometers away from the city of Sumy. That's less than half an hour's drive for military vehicles. But there's no need to despair ahead of time. After all, Ukrainian defenders are putting up serious resistance, and the Russians don't have operational reserves to capture the regional center. However, against this backdrop, the aggressor may resort to its favorite tactic, terrorizing the civilian population.
In my opinion, the occupiers will switch to a tactic of terror against the civilian population. That is, not selective strikes, but attacks on residential neighborhoods aimed at sowing chaos, panic among the civilian population, and distrust toward the actions of central and local authorities. And most importantly, to provoke mass migration deeper into Ukrainian territory.
It also cannot be ruled out that the Russian advance in the Sumy region may be part of a broader plan. For example, just as the Ukrainian armed forces entered the Kursk region to disrupt the Russian offensive in Donbas. Now, they might be putting pressure on Sumy to force Ukraine to redeploy reserves from the south. This would open up an opportunity for the occupiers to advance in the Zaporizhia region. And all these bloodthirsty actions by Putin's horde are happening in parallel with enormous losses. After all, the Russian war machine spares no one.
The tactics of the Russian occupiers involve small infantry groups without support from heavy armored vehicles. This tactic is a result of the successful actions of Ukrainian drones. Up to 70% losses in personnel and heavy armor.
Some are killed, and then other groups move in, and this basically happens every day. Their objective is to amass forces on Ukrainian territory and essentially to expand the combat zone across our country. But as we can see, the enemy is unable to achieve any significant advance.
Despite the fact that the situation is tense along the entire front line, the Ukrainian armed forces control every section of it and are doing everything possible to stop and destroy the enemy.
Now, Putin is accusing Ukrainians of terrorism. His word sounds especially cynical against the backdrop of this war. The Russian dictator is threatening to walk away from negotiations, but somehow he still finds time to chat with Donald Trump. And Trump goes public with the details of that call, but then deletes the post and then re-uploads it. Oh, and the Pope spoke with Putin too, just before the latest mass attack. More details in our next segment.
The Ukrainian armed forces struck Iskander missile systems in the Bryansk region. It is reported that a unit of Russian troops attempted to launch a strike on one of the Ukrainian cities, most likely Kyiv. As a result of the strike, one enemy missile launcher detonated and two more were likely damaged. The Ministry of Defense of the occupying country also stated that yesterday evening, within just a few hours, 29 Ukrainian drones were shot down. 15 drones were allegedly shot down over the Belgorod region, another 11 over the Rostov region, and 3 over the Voronezh region. US President Donald Trump stated that on Wednesday he had a good conversation with Vladimir Putin, but not the kind that would lead to immediate peace. Trump also reported that Putin wants to retaliate against Ukraine for the special operation Web.
Such statements were intended to sow chaos and panic among the Ukrainian population. So, what was the outcome? In the end, it was the so-called external factor that played a role, indicating that Russia is not the decision maker when it comes to the use of tactical nuclear weapons. This refers to the position of the Russian Federation's strategic partners, China and India. A clear and firm response from Beijing to Russia's nuclear blackmail. In today's globalized world, not only is the use of nuclear weapons unacceptable, but even nuclear rhetoric is intolerable.
As a result of the special operation Web, Ukraine has indeed put out of action 30% of Russia's workhorses, as these former aircraft are called in NATO. The New York Times, citing unnamed American officials, reports that in response to attacks on airfields, Russia may use medium-range ballistic missiles, specifically the Oreshnik, which is favored by Russians and was already used by Russia to strike the Ukrainian city of Dnipro in November of last year.
I do not rule out the possibility of strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. This scenario is also being considered by the Russian Federation itself. Moreover, we are talking about strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, practically across the entire territory of our country. The goal is to paralyze the Ukrainian economy and accordingly Ukraine's defense industry.
Experts do not rule out, unfortunately, Russia's now traditional strikes on Ukrainian civilian targets. The US Embassy in Ukraine notes that in recent weeks, Russia has increased the intensity of missile and drone attacks against Ukraine. And now there is a constant risk of significant air attacks.
The possibility of strikes on logistics infrastructure cannot be ruled out. Strikes on bridges across the Dnipro are also possible. Moreover, this thesis is once again being circulated in Russian media as a so-called retaliatory action in response to operations by the security service of Ukraine aimed at neutralizing an illegal engineering structure, which is referred to as either the Crimean Bridge or the Kerch Bridge.
The situation is currently difficult for Ukrainians in the Sumy direction. The Russians continue to advance in the region and attack the regional center with Shahed drones.
The occupiers plan to establish fire control not only over the residential districts of the regional center, Sumy, but accordingly, the same tactics will be used by the occupiers in the Kharkiv and Zaporizhzhia directions as well.
The Russian leadership understands that, given the shortage of operational reserves, it will not be able to capture Sumy or Dnipro, toward which the occupiers' army is also advancing. This is also confirmed by NATO intelligence. However, indiscriminate shelling of cities aimed at provoking population migration is already taking place. Additionally, the Russians may use their advances in the aforementioned regions as a means of political pressure in possible upcoming negotiations.
Putin clearly wants to prolong the war, and he's coming up with new reasons to avoid direct talks with President Zelensky. What a coincidence, right? Let's not forget the so-called Ryazan Sugar, a false flag terror attacks organized by Russian security services back in the day. They've done it before. They can do it again. Diplomacy? They're terrible at it. Terror? They've got a PhD in that.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.
After Putin's comments rejecting peace talks, Russian stocks and the ruble took a dive. Is this the end of Russia's economy? Not yet, but the collapse could snowball.
What have you done, Kremlin master? Now, with his useless statements, he has made Russia's economy even worse.
Trying to intimidate Russia, the Kyiv leadership has resorted to organizing terrorist acts, and at the same time is asking to suspend hostilities for 30 or even 60 days, and is requesting a high-level meeting. How can such meetings be held under these circumstances? What is there to talk about? Who even negotiates with those who rely on terror, with terrorists?
Indeed, who conducts any kind of dialogue with terrorists? All right then. As a result of Putin's threats to withdraw from negotiations, the ruble and Russian stocks fell during trading.
The Russian economy is also very, as they say, sensitive. That is, it is highly responsive to the news that comes out. And once again, there was an expectation that these negotiations taking place in Istanbul would lead to peace. Peace would lead to the lifting of sanctions, and everything would be wonderful. But then comes Putin's statement that we don't want negotiations at all.
But while Putin was delivering his speech, the MOEX index lost all of its daily gains and closed almost unchanged. The ruble weakened, the yuan rose above 11 rubles, the dollar almost reached 80, and the euro went above 90.
As for the Russian ruble, it's important to understand that to a large extent its exchange rate is artificial. And accordingly, when the Central Bank of Russia itself loosens or tightens policy here and there, it's not because the market demands it, but because that's what they think. That's what the experts at the Central Bank of Russia believe. This, by the way, is a major problem. I wouldn't say this will now create a clear trend, but it will add to the many negative factors that are already present in the Russian economy. Because right now we are slowly witnessing the gradual decline of certain sectors of the Russian economy.
Analysts at Finam note that it is precisely the uncertainty surrounding the resolution of the conflict that continues to put pressure on the market. Apparently, investors do not see a clear plan, and this adds to the tension.
At the moment, the situation for Russia is far from ideal. How long Russia can hold out is a question everyone is asking. It's hard to say, but now we're waiting for the results from May. As for the National Welfare Fund, that's the Russian government's reserve. Plus, once again, there are requests from the Russian government to the central bank to provide foreign exchange and gold reserves. But foreign exchange and gold reserves are not meant to solve economic problems. They exist to ensure the stability of the national currency. That's why the central bank also doesn't want to do this.
As for the ruble, people say that the Russian currency is under a lot of pressure due to falling oil prices. But in recent days, that hasn't been particularly noticeable. After all, it seems like the ruble isn't doing all that badly.
Right now, for Russia, for a country that, like the Soviet Union, is largely dependent on all 27% of budget revenues come from oil and gas. And these oil and gas revenues depend on the healthy functioning of the economy. And a healthy economy means loans, but loans are currently expensive, so that doesn't bring in profits either. So it turns out that oil remains the main source of income.
Now, let's talk about oil itself. According to the Ministry of Economic Development, in May, the Urals grade was sold abroad at an average of $52 per barrel, which, by the way, is the lowest price since the summer of 2023. And compared to January, Russian oil has dropped in price by no less than 23%.
In the Russian budget adopted at the end of last year, 2024, the price of oil was set at $69.7 per barrel. It is already clear that it will not be like that. And just last week, the Russian State Duma passed amendments to the budget, and now the price is already $56, not $69.7 per barrel. This is despite the fact that the cost of oil production in Russia is estimated to be in the range of $45 to $50 per barrel.
The Russian economy, much like the Crimean Bridge, may appear solid on the surface, but even targeted strikes eventually take their toll. Destruction is only a matter of time, especially when the person at the helm is laying mines himself by continuing a war that primarily harms his own country.
And finally, is the bromance really over? It looks like President Trump and billionaire Elon Musk had a serious falling out. Personally, I'll call this an unfolding situation. Too early for conclusions, but the consequences could go far beyond the US and might even affect Ukraine, because this situation could be used by our enemies. Still, since we're talking about two businessmen and strategic minds, let's look at the numbers. According to Axios, the scandal between the former buddies cost the US president over $1 billion. First, Trump's media company, Trump's Media and Technology Group, lost 8% in value. Second, the Trump meme coin dropped by 10%. Meanwhile, Elon Musk lost nearly $20 billion, mostly due to a sharp decline in Tesla's stock. We'll be watching this story as it develops. That's all for today. Thank you for being with us. We read your comments and feel your support. Strength to Ukraine's defenders. Glory to Ukraine. Like, subscribe, and see you next time.